July 12, 1943. Kursk Salient, Soviet Union. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with summer dust. Inside the cramped hull of a T-34 medium tank, 4 Soviet soldiers felt the vibration of the 26.5-ton machine beneath them as enemy shells exploded in the wheat fields around their position. The driver sat in his seat on the left side of the hull, hands on the controls, watching through a narrow vision slit as German Panzer IVs advanced across the open ground. Then, the sound, a metallic crack, followed by white light flooding the crew compartment. The German 75mm armor-piercing shell had found its mark. If you want to hear more untold stories from the Eastern Front, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment about which World War II battle you want us to cover next. And subscribe, because we're bringing you the real history that changed the world. Now, let's continue with what happened inside that burning tank. The T-34 was the Soviet Union's answer to German armored superiority. Designed in 1939 and entering production in 1940, it represented a revolutionary approach to tank design. Sloped armor that increased effective thickness without adding weight. A powerful W2 diesel engine producing 500 horsepower. Wide tracks that distributed weight across soft ground. A 76.2mm main gun capable of penetrating 3 inches of armor at 500 yards. When German forces first encountered T-34s during Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, they were shocked. German tank commanders reported that their 37mm and 50mm guns bounced off T-34 armor at combat ranges. The Soviets had produced a tank that changed the rules of armored warfare. But the T-34 had serious flaws that Soviet tankers discovered quickly. The crew compartment was cramped beyond belief. 4 men, the driver, hull machine gunner, commander, and loader, worked in a space smaller than most modern cars. The driver sat on the left side of the hull with his legs stretched forward toward the bow. His seat had no padding. The controls, 2 steering levers and a floor-mounted accelerator, required constant physical effort to operate. Above his head, a single hatch opened forward, hinged at the front. To escape through this hatch, the driver had to release the latch, push the heavy steel plate upward against spring tension, then pull himself up and out while the tank was possibly moving, possibly under fire, possibly already burning. The hull machine gunner sat to the driver's right, operating the .762mm DT machine gun mounted in the bow. His position was even more confined. He had no independent hatch. If he needed to evacuate, he had to squeeze past the driver or use the small belly escape hatch located under the center of the hull between both positions. This belly hatch, roughly 2 feet square, dropped down on hinges. A man had to lie flat, lower himself through the opening feet first, then drop to the ground while the tank passed over him. If the tank was moving, this maneuver was nearly impossible. If the tank was on fire, it was a choice between burning alive inside or being crushed beneath 26 tons of steel. The commander and loader worked in the turret. The T-34-76, the version used in 1943, had a 2-man turret that Germans described as cramped and inefficient. The commander had to direct the tank, identify targets, command the crew, load the main gun, and operate the radio when one was installed. Most T-34s had no radio. Communication between tanks relied on flag signals or simply following the lead tank. The loader, when present, assisted with ammunition and operated a second .762mm machine gun in the rear of the turret. Both men stood on the turret floor, which was actually the top of the hull. There was no turret basket, no platform that rotated with the turret. When the turret turned, the commander and loader had to shuffle their feet to avoid getting caught on equipment bolted to the hull. The crew of 4 became 3 on many T-34s because the Red Army couldn't train loaders fast enough to replace casualties. The commander loaded the gun himself, a process that took precious seconds during combat. He would identify a target, traverse the turret using a hand crank, aim using crude optics, then step back from the gun, grab a shell from one of the ammunition racks, load it into the breech, close the breech, step back to the gun sight, re-aim because the target had moved,
and fire. A well-trained commander could do this in perhaps 20 seconds. A German Panther or Tiger with a 3-man turret crew could fire 3 or 4 rounds in the same time. The statistics were brutal. Soviet records show that approximately 28% of Soviet T-34 crewmen died when their tank was knocked out. This was higher than the American Sherman at 24.6% and reflected the T-34's combination of cramped interior, limited escape routes, and the ferocity of combat on the Eastern Front. Of the 403,272 Soviet tank crew members trained during World War II, approximately 310,000 perished. This represents a death rate of roughly 77%, though this includes all tank types and all causes of death, including disease, accidents, and execution for desertion or failure. The Battle of Kursk, which began on July 5, 1943, was the largest tank battle in history. The Germans committed approximately 2,700 tanks and assault guns. The Soviets had assembled roughly 5,000 tanks to defend the Kursk Salient. The battle was a grinding, brutal affair, fought across open steppe where German gunners could engage Soviet tanks at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters. The T-34's advantages in armor and mobility meant little when German Tigers and Panthers could destroy them before Soviet guns could effectively return fire. Inside the T-34 on July 12, the driver had no warning before the shell struck. German gunners targeted the hull preferentially because penetrating the hull guaranteed killing or incapacitating at least 2 crew members and often disabled the tank's mobility. The 75mm armor-piercing shell, fired from a Panzer IV at approximately 800 meters, struck the right front side of the hull at a slight angle. The T-34's armor at this point measured 45 millimeters thick at 60 degrees from vertical. This gave it an effective thickness of approximately 90 millimeters against the shell striking perpendicular to the surface. But the German shell hit at an angle that reduced this effective thickness. It penetrated.
The physics of tank penetration are straightforward but horrifying. The armor-piercing shell, traveling at approximately 740 meters per second, carried kinetic energy equivalent to several sticks of dynamite. When it struck the armor, the shell's hardened steel penetrator began forcing its way through the rolled homogeneous armor plate. Metal heated to incandescence. Fragments of armor plate, called spall, broke free from the interior surface and flew across the crew compartment at velocities exceeding 1,000 meters per second. These fragments, ranging in size from dust particles to chunks the size of a fist, became deadly projectiles. The shell itself, if it remained intact after penetration, continued through the tank until it struck something solid or exited through thinner armor on the opposite side. In this case, the shell passed through the right side of the hull crew compartment, missing the driver by perhaps 18 inches. It struck the hull machine gunner directly. He died instantly, his torso shredded by the hardened steel penetrator traveling faster than the speed of sound. The shell then impacted the transmission housing, a massive cast steel assembly located between the driver and hull gunner. The impact fractured the shell and sent fragments ricocheting through the compartment. The driver felt the blast wave, a sudden spike in air pressure that felt like being punched by an invisible fist. The sound was beyond loud, beyond description, a physical force that ruptured his left eardrum instantly. He couldn't hear the screaming of his hull gunner, who was already dead. He couldn't hear the engine, still running at combat RPM. He couldn't hear the commander shouting orders from the turret above. All he heard was a high-pitched ringing that would never completely fade. Then the fire started. The penetrating shell had severed hydraulic lines and damaged fuel lines running along the right side of the hull. Diesel fuel began spraying into the crew compartment. Diesel is less flammable than gasoline, one of the T-34's supposed advantages, but diesel will burn when atomized into a fine mist and exposed to a sufficient ignition source. The white-hot metal fragments provided that ignition source. Within 2 seconds of penetration, flames filled the right side of the crew compartment. Diesel fires are different from gasoline fires. They don't explode with a dramatic fireball. They burn with intense, sustained heat that produces thick, black smoke. The smoke is toxic, filled with carbon monoxide and partially burned hydrocarbons. 1 or 2 breaths of the smoke will incapacitate a man. 3 or 4 breaths will kill him. The driver had perhaps 10 seconds before the smoke concentration in the crew compartment reached lethal levels. His training took over. Release the steering levers. foot off the accelerator. The engine would keep running. There was no emergency engine shutoff in the driver's position. Reach up with both hands. Find the hatch latch. Pull the latch. The hatch was held closed by spring tension and sometimes jammed from combat damage or simple misalignment. He pulled harder. The latch released. Push the hatch up and forward. The hatch, made of 45mm steel plate, weighed approximately 80 pounds. Pushing it up required strength, and the driver was already weakened by the blast wave and beginning smoke inhalation. The hatch opened. Fresh air rushed in, feeding the fire behind him. He grabbed the edges of the hatch opening and pulled himself up. His hands, covered in thin leather gloves, felt the heat radiating from the steel hatch that had been baking in the summer sun. He got his head and shoulders through the opening. Behind him, flames were climbing the back of his seat. His padded leather tanker's helmet protected his head for a few seconds. His padded leather jacket protected his torso, but his legs were still inside the tank. He felt the heat before he felt pain. His trousers, made of cotton, ignited. Diesel fuel that had sprayed onto his boots and lower legs began to burn. He screamed, a sound he couldn't hear through his ruptured eardrum, and pulled himself further through the hatch. His legs cleared the opening. He rolled off the front of the tank, a drop of approximately 6 feet to the ground. He landed on his left side in the wheat stubble. The pain hit him then. Third-degree burns don't hurt initially because the nerve endings are destroyed, but the driver had suffered burns across a spectrum of severity. Third-degree burns covered his legs from mid-thigh down. Second-degree burns covered his lower back where his jacket had pulled up. First-degree burns covered his arms where the heat had penetrated his jacket sleeves. The first and second-degree burns hurt with an intensity that overwhelmed conscious thought. He rolled on the ground, instinctively trying to extinguish flames that were no longer burning. Other Soviet tanks in his unit had already spotted the hit and moved to support. One T-34 stopped beside him, its commander dropping from the turret to drag the burned driver away from his destroyed tank. The driver was conscious but in shock. His eyes were open but unfocused. He was making sounds but not words. The commander, a lieutenant whose name the driver would never learn, pulled him behind a low rise in the ground that provided cover from German positions. The lieutenant shouted for a medic, though medics rarely accompanied attacking tank formations. The destroyed T-34 continued to burn. The commander and loader, if they had survived the initial penetration, had not escaped. Their hatches remained closed. Ammunition began cooking off inside the turret, muffled thumps that sent smoke pouring from the hatches. The tank would burn for hours, and when the fire finally died, recovery crews would find 2 bodies in the turret, burned beyond recognition, and 1 body in the hull, the machine gunner who had died in the first second of the attack. The driver was one of the fortunate ones. He had escaped, but his ordeal was just beginning. Soviet medical doctrine called for a 3-stage evacuation system. The first stage was the battalion aid station, typically located a few kilometers behind the front lines. Here, medical orderlies provided immediate first aid, stopping bleeding, treating shock, and determining which casualties needed further evacuation. The second stage was the field hospital, located 15 to 20 kilometers behind the front. These hospitals had surgeons, operating facilities, and could treat serious wounds. The third stage was the base hospital, located far behind the front, where long-term recovery took place. Getting from the battlefield to the battalion aid station was the most dangerous part. Wounded soldiers often died not from their wounds, but from secondary injuries, shock, or simply being left on the battlefield too long. The driver was lucky. The lieutenant who had pulled him to cover stayed with him until a medical truck arrived 2 hours later. The driver spent those 2 hours in a state approaching delirium, alternating between screaming from pain and silent periods where he seemed almost comatose.
The medical truck, a American-made Studebaker US-6 supplied through Lend-Lease, carried him to the battalion aid station. The medical orderly who examined him assessed the burns at approximately 70% of his body, concentrated on his lower extremities. Third-degree burns are characterized by white or charred skin, destroyed tissue that looks leathery, and complete loss of pain sensation in the affected area. Second-degree burns show blistering, extreme redness, and intense pain. The driver had both types across different areas of his legs, back, and arms. The orderly administered morphine, the standard Soviet pain reliever, though morphine supplies were often inadequate. He applied tannic acid solution to the burns, a treatment that Soviet medical doctrine had adopted based on pre-war research. Tannic acid, derived from tree bark, was thought to form a protective coating over burns and reduce infection risk. Modern medical science has since determined that tannic acid treatment is ineffective and possibly
harmful, but in 1943 it was standard practice. The orderly then wrapped the burns in gauze bandages and marked the driver for immediate evacuation to the field hospital. The statistics on burn survival in World War II were grim. Medical literature from the period indicated that patients with third-degree burns covering more than 30% of their body faced approximately 50% mortality, even with treatment. Burns covering 50% or more of the body were considered almost certainly fatal. The driver had burns covering 70% of his body. By the medical standards of 1943, he should have died within days from infection, fluid loss, or organ failure. But he didn't die. At the field hospital, Soviet surgeons worked to stabilize him. The first 48 hours after a severe burn are critical. The body loses massive amounts of fluid through the damaged skin. This fluid loss causes shock, drops blood pressure, and can lead to kidney failure. Soviet doctors administered intravenous saline solution to replace lost fluids, though IV supplies were chronically short. They debrided the worst of the burns, cutting away dead tissue to prevent infection. They administered sulfa drugs, the first generation of antibiotics to fight bacterial infection that inevitably sets in with severe burns. The Soviet medical system during World War II was primitive by Western standards, but remarkably effective given the circumstances. Soviet surgeons dealt with millions of casualties, learned through brutal experience what treatments worked, and adapted quickly. Burn treatment protocols developed by Soviet researchers during the war represented significant advances. They discovered that early excision of burn tissue and immediate grafting improved survival rates. They developed new techniques for fluid resuscitation. They pioneered the use of physiological saline baths to treat burns, a technique that reduced pain and infection rates. The driver spent 3 months in the field hospital, then was evacuated to a base hospital in the Urals, far from the front. He underwent multiple surgeries. Doctors performed skin grafts, taking healthy skin from his upper body and chest to cover the burned areas on his legs. These grafts had limited success. Many failed to take, requiring repeated attempts. The driver developed infections despite sulfa drug treatment. He ran fevers that approached lethal levels. Twice, doctors thought he would die within hours. Twice, he survived. The symbolic object in this story is not a weapon or a piece of equipment. It's bread. Soviet soldiers received a daily ration of black bread, approximately 800 grams when supplies permitted. This bread, made from rye flour and often containing sawdust or other fillers, was dense, heavy, and filling. It represented survival on the most basic level. When the driver was pulled from the battlefield, the lieutenant gave him a piece of bread from his own ration. He couldn't eat it. His throat was too damaged from smoke inhalation, but he held it in his hand. In the medical truck, the orderly gave him another piece of bread. At the aid station, the field hospital, the base hospital, there was always bread. Sometimes it was all there was. Bread in the Soviet Union had symbolic meaning beyond nutrition. The phrase bread and salt represented hospitality and welcome. During the siege of Leningrad, people died clutching their bread rations. Soviet propaganda posters showed workers and soldiers holding bread, the fruit of collective labor. For the driver, recovering slowly in a hospital bed with burns covering most of his lower body, bread meant something simpler. It meant he was still alive. Every day he could eat bread was a day he had survived. His recovery took more than a year. Soviet military doctrine called for wounded soldiers to be returned to active duty as soon as medically possible. The Red Army needed every man, but even the Soviet military recognized that some wounds ended a soldier's combat effectiveness permanently. The driver's burns had destroyed most of the skin on his legs. The grafts had covered some areas, but left others with exposed tissue that refused to heal. He could walk, eventually, with a cane. He could perform light labor, but he could never again sit in the cramped driver's compartment of a T-34 and operate the controls for hours during combat operations. He was discharged from military service in late 1944, classified as a disabled veteran, and sent to a rehabilitation center where he learned bookkeeping. The Soviet Union had millions of disabled veterans by 1945, men missing limbs, blinded, or, like the driver, carrying burns or wounds that left them unable to perform physical labor. These men were often forgotten, given small pensions, and expected to survive however they could. The driver was more fortunate than many. His burns, while extensive, hadn't left him completely incapacitated. He could walk.
He could care for himself. He had survived. The transformation this experience produced was profound. Before the war, the driver was a farmer's son from Ukraine, conscripted in 1942 at age 19, trained for 6 weeks on how to operate a T-34, and sent to the front. He had believed what Soviet propaganda told him, that the T-34 was the best tank in the world, that Soviet technology and Soviet courage would defeat fascism, and that the war would end in victory, and he would return home a hero. The penetrating 75mm shell destroyed those beliefs as thoroughly as it destroyed his tank.
He learned that survival was random. The machine gunner, sitting 18 inches to his right, had died instantly. The driver had escaped with burns that should have killed him but didn't. There was no fairness, no justice, no divine plan. The shell struck where it struck. Some men died, some men lived. The difference was inches and seconds and chance. He learned that the T-34, despite Soviet propaganda, was not a wonder weapon. It was a machine with advantages and flaws, built to be mass-produced rather than perfected, designed to overwhelm German quality with Soviet quantity. Soviet factories produced approximately 84,000 tanks during World War II, including over 57,000 T-34s of various models. They could replace losses faster than the Germans could inflict them, but this meant that tank crews were expendable. The tank mattered, the crew didn't. He learned that pain has a limit beyond which the mind simply shuts down. During the worst of his burn treatment, during the debridements where doctors cut away dead tissue without adequate anesthesia because morphine was needed for other casualties, during the failed grafts that had to be removed and attempted again, he found a place in his mind where pain couldn't reach. He went there and stayed there until the pain ended. This ability to disconnect from physical suffering would stay with him for the rest of his life. He would describe it decades later as both a blessing and a curse. It let him survive. It made him something less than fully human. The epilogue of this story is not about the driver alone. It's about the 310,000 Soviet tank crewmen who died during World War II, the millions of Soviet soldiers who became casualties, and the larger truth about the Eastern Front that Western histories often miss. The Soviet Union defeated Nazi Germany by accepting casualties that would have broken any other nation. From 1941 to 1945, Soviet military deaths totaled approximately 8.7 million soldiers. Civilian deaths from combat, starvation, disease, and genocide totaled approximately 19 million. The Soviet people paid the price for victory in blood. The driver's survival, his escape from the burning tank, his recovery from burns that should have killed him, was one small victory in a war composed of millions of small tragedies. He lived. Most didn't. He carried the scars for the rest of his life, both the physical scars of burned skin that never fully healed, and the psychological scars of watching his crewmates die, of knowing he survived while they didn't, of understanding that his survival meant nothing to the larger machinery of war that ground up men and tanks with equal indifference. The bread he received at every stage of his evacuation and recovery represented something larger than sustenance. It represented the Soviet system's promise to its citizens that if you served, if you sacrificed, if you bled for the motherland, you would be cared for. This promise was unevenly kept. Some disabled veterans received adequate support. Many didn't. The driver received a pension that let him survive but not prosper. He received medical care that kept him alive but couldn't restore what was destroyed. He received acknowledgement of his service but no celebration of his survival.
The larger truth this story illuminates is that technological superiority means little without the will to use it at any cost. The T-34 was revolutionary in design, but flawed in execution. Its cramped interior, limited vision devices, poor ergonomics, and inadequate crew escape provisions made it a difficult tank to fight in and a dangerous tank to escape from. But the Soviet Union produced them by the tens of thousands and crewed them with young men who had minimal training and were expected to learn in combat or die in the attempt. This was the Soviet approach to warfare. Accept the casualties, replace the losses, keep attacking. The human cost was immense, but the strategic calculus was simple. The Soviet Union had 196 million people. Germany had 80 million. The Soviets could afford to lose men faster than Germany could kill them and still have numerical superiority. This wasn't incompetence or disregard for human life.
though those elements existed. It was pragmatic recognition that in an existential war for survival, casualties were the price of victory. The driver understood this in a way few civilians could. He had been part of the machine, one replaceable component among millions. His tank had been destroyed. He had been replaced. Another driver climbed into another T-34 and drove toward German positions. That driver might have survived. Probably didn't. Was replaced in turn. The war continued. The bodies accumulated. The Soviet Union won. Freedom and democracy, the abstract concepts Western nations fought for, meant little on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union was not a democracy. Stalin's regime was brutal, totalitarian, and had killed millions of its own citizens through purges, collectivization, and manufactured famines. But when Germany invaded in June 1941, when German armies besieged Leningrad, when Nazi ideology called for the extermination of Slavic peoples and the colonization of Soviet territory, the Soviet people fought not for abstract political principles, but for survival. The driver fought because he was conscripted. He survived because of chance. He recovered because Soviet doctors, working with limited resources and treating massive numbers of casualties, had developed effective burn treatment protocols. He returned to civilian life because the Red Army didn't need a disabled veteran who could no longer drive a tank. His story is not unique. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers suffered similar burns. Many died. Some survived. All were expected to continue serving the state however they could. The recurring image of bread, the simple sustenance that marked every stage of his journey from battlefield to recovery to post-war life, encapsulates the Soviet promise and the Soviet reality. There will be bread. You will survive if you can. The state will provide the minimum necessary to keep you functioning. Anything more is your own responsibility. This was not the abundance Americans experienced, the surplus and variety that American soldiers took for granted. This was subsistence, survival, the bare minimum to sustain life. The driver lived into old age, dying in 1987 at age 64. The burns had shortened his life, causing chronic health problems that worsened over decades. But he lived longer than most of his generation, longer than the estimated 27 million Soviet citizens who died during the war, longer than reasonable medical prediction in 1943 would have given him. He married after the war, had children, worked as a bookkeeper for a collective farm, never spoke much about his experience. When he did, he focused on simple details: the sound before the shell hit, the heat of the hatch, the taste of black bread given by strangers. His story ends not with triumph or tragedy, but with simple endurance. He was a Soviet tank driver who suffered catastrophic burns and survived. Nothing about his survival was heroic. He didn't save anyone. He didn't accomplish a great feat. He simply refused to die when dying was expected. This refusal, this stubborn persistence in the face of overwhelming pain and trauma, was replicated millions of times across the Soviet Union during World War II. Collectively, these individual acts of survival defeated Nazi Germany, not through superiority of technology or tactics, but through the simple, grinding reality that the Soviet people would not break, no matter how much they bled. The bread he clutched in his burned hand on July 12, 1943, represented this truth. Survival requires sustenance. The state will provide the minimum. Whether you live or die depends on your ability to endure. He endured. Most didn't. The difference was not virtue or skill, but luck and the random trajectories of armor-piercing shells fired by enemy tanks across open steppe in the summer of 1943.